Well, my presentation today is about this issue of what I've called the absent presences of parents and communities when conducting ethnographies in schools. And this really comes from my PhD research, which was part of an ethnographic study of religious education in secondary schools in the UK. We were in 24 schools. I was personally in 10 of the schools in the project, and we carried out what in ethnographic terms is relatively short ethnographies. We were there for about 10 days in each of the schools, a minimum of 10 days in each of the schools, which was sort of just long enough for schools and teachers and students to kind of get used to having an ethnographer around. And one of the things that really came up out of this was the community dimension. So we talk about, well, not so much anymore because of academization, but we talk about community schools. You know, the common school is usually termed the community school. They have community governors. Governors are often parents or people living in the local community, and they have a role in setting the values and ethos dimensions of a school. And particularly in something like religious education, we found that the RE class was one of the places where kind of local demographic, faith community, community outreach, charitable work dimensions of the school were most evident. You know, it was one of the areas where there was a little bit of latitude for teachers to move away from thinking of a kind of an abstract national curriculum kind of picture towards more local demographic considerations. So parents do always set the context in which school interactions are framed, you know, but most school-based research, even ethnographic research, tends to treat the school as a bit of a black box, really. So engaging with what happens in the lives of young people outside of their 8:30 to 3:30 Monday to Friday schooling is not something that I haven't read much school-based ethnography that considers that sort of community dimension, the sort of influence of parents and the wider community that young people are living in. There were elements in which this community dimension kind of made itself manifest in this research. Some of them were things like parents' evenings. I was able to attend a parents' evening in a couple of schools, and you then start to see something of what teachers see of the parents. That's a particular point of encounter, I suppose. There was one case where I was walking around a town that had just arrived in to do the ethnographic work. It was a town in the north of Scotland, and was really just kind of looking around the town, seeing what was around, and kind of bumped into the church minister who, recognized that I wasn't from around there and was kind of asking what I was doing. I mentioned this project, and then invited me to come over and talk at length about the relationship or lack of relationship between the local church and the school and RE, which I'm really not sure what to do with that, because it was a completely random encounter and something that I never actually, never really drew upon in the rest of the research. So what do we do with these absent presences? So one of the things that I've drawn upon here is a study by Deborah Vitalia on these objects. This is a Trobriand axe blade from the Trobriand Islands in the South Pacific. And Vitalia is quite old school kind of ethnographer, kind of contemporary of Clifford Geertz and that kind of period of anthropology. Writes this study of Trobriand axe blades and their ritual purposes. And one of the things about these blades is that they are always hidden. They have this kind of ritual invisibility that the foreground islanders don't take these blades out because they represent they represent a kind of a foundational and quite a violent kind of foundational power. So they keep them kind of under beds or under the floorboards of houses. They're hidden because they represent both violence and kind of family dynastic power in some way. And she writes about this notion of their being made invisible. You know, that there is something, but the fact that these things are made invisible, they're sort of disjointed from the realm of ordinary meaning making. And so it made me think about what is made invisible in the classroom. What's not present? What's deliberately not visible in the school environment? What is that sort of present, conspicuous by its absence? And how do we engage with those things that are kind of conspicuous by their absence? One of the things that's obviously conspicuous by its absence in a school is families. Anyone who's not a child of that particular year group is not there. You know, and that's so obvious that we don't even really think about it. So I was trying to think, how do I find out if I'm just sitting in a class of year 11 students, RE year 11 classroom, how do I find out what matters in those people's lives outside of that classroom, outside of that very artificial environment where they're all together in a kind of age group? So one of the techniques that I've looked at was this idea that Lorgas calls cultural domain analysis. And this is about what Lorgas defines as a cultural domain is basically the ways in which facts about the world and their meanings are constructed from the inside of a culture. So he talks about mapping the items and interactions in a cultural domain. So what sort of other items, other people, organizations do people name as being in their cultural domain? What is in people's kind of sphere of meaning making? And he talks about mapping salience, so how often, how quickly do people bring up different factors when they're talking about their lives within the context of the RE research. One of the big questions was, you know, what do people bring up when they're thinking about religion? Is it something that they are part of, their church, their religious community? Is it their home? Is it something that's out there, something that's other people, learning about the other in some sense? You know, where does this take place? You know, what's the cultural domain of religious education? Is it learning about the kind of thing that I do as a religious person, or is it learning about the kind of thing that those religious people out there do? You know, but not something that would ever kind of encroach on me. And sometimes the cultural domain can be a kind of an imagined place as well as a real one. How do we get there? How do you make that into a kind of a methodology? Lorgas talks about two different methods, and in some ways quite similar to what Erin was saying about photo elicitation, the cultural domain elicitation. You can go for the structured approach where you simply ask the participants to list everything or everyone that's in their cultural domain. That's the sort of structured approach. You say you're setting out to do this kind of cultural domain analysis. The approach that we took was more of an unstructured approach, which Lorgas calls unstructured free lists, which is where you just map this cultural domain as it appears in interviews, in observations, field notes, just as people mention different items, different objects, different individuals. Borgatti talks about salience being about how often an item is mentioned and how quickly. And in some ways, I think that's easier to do with the unstructured list. If people keep coming back in an interview, they keep coming back again and again to their relationship to a particular community figure or a particular parent who has an influence or a particular text. You can say that that's something that has some kind of salience for them. The other approach which I'm starting to work with on another project looking at the prevent agenda in schools is the idea of sociograms. So Maren and Wellman talk about these as a way of kind of asking participants to link through a social network diagram. So there are a couple of different approaches to this. And funnily enough, because this was something that came from some research I've been doing around the prevent agenda in schools, preventing violent extremism. In the DFE report on the Trojan horse affair a couple of years ago in schools, they actually used something like this as a way of mapping the connections between various people who they see as being central to this, this apparent takeover, if it indeed was. So this approach of kind of linking, showing the links between key members of the trust, discussion groups of schools, this sort of network analysis, I thought seemed like quite an interesting idea, and it seemed to be something that people who were working in this field were already familiar with. So that was kind of where I went with this. Social network analysis, Maren and Wellman talk about two different approaches. They talk about whole network versus ego network approaches. And the whole network is sort of like the thing that we've seen there, where there's an attempt to map the trust as a whole and all of its links, all the links between all the different nodes. The ego network starts with the research participant in the middle. So you just ask them to map all of the people who are in their personal network. Maren and Wellman talk about this giving a kind of a bird's eye view of the social structure if you take the whole network approach, whereas the ego network approach, it has a sort of node-specific perspective. So what you then do with this, I suppose, depends to an extent on your epistemological stance. So what do you do with an ego network? Is this something which, if you're taking more of a phenomenological approach, that would be that individual's perception of their social world, their cultural domain? If you're taking a more, I suppose, constructivist or intersubjective kind of paradigm, as Borgatti does, he talks about this intersubjective construction, then in some way you have to start overlapping some of these egocentric networks and starting to see where the contradictions are, where the absences, where the salient links exist. So there's a question as well of what counts as a node. And Brager looks at the difference between purely individual social networks of treating a node as always being a person, and I think he calls it a two-step or a two-stage social network where you have individuals and also groups that they belong to within your social network analysis, which gets a bit complicated at that point. I've included Bennett's idea as well as agentic assemblage, which takes more of a post-humanist perspective, the idea that when we're looking at a social network like this, agency is produced not by the individuals in the network, but by the network itself, in the assemblage itself. So it's the network itself that acts rather than individuals within it. So these were a few sort of tools and ideas for thinking about the presence of communities, or the absent presence of communities in schools. And I wanted to think about, I suppose, some unique challenges that this has in educational research, which are that, first of all, if we're talking about ego networks, the likelihood is that most students are going to have a completely unique ego network because of the influence of their family life. And that becomes increasingly so when you look at sort of the social networks online that students are involved in. These might not be coterminous with their sort of school life. There are questions about imagined and fictive cultural domains. So there are certain sort of cultural commonplaces that exist in schools, one of which is the sort of narrative that you do well, you succeed in exams, you go to higher education, you get a good job. But that whole narrative, where does that come from? You know, how does that cultural domain fit in? Where are the individuals within that? You know, is this a cultural domain that's based on people that they actually know, or are we back to this imagined other, these successful university graduates as this kind of imagined other? I think there's also a question of one of the other things that's made invisible in the classroom is the influence of technology. You know, that kids spend so much of their time online, except when they're at school. So there are other things that, you know, we actually like being able to cut some of these social networks up. I think being able to cut kids out of that social network, both of their homes, communities, Facebook friends, being able to like cut a little space out of that for their school time is actually quite convenient. It has certain you know, positives as well. But it makes doing ethnography in schools a strangely artificial process. Just want to see how we're doing for time.
Well, you have some extra time, don't you? You're supposed to be starting at 10 past, so
okay,
you're doing fine for time.
Yeah, doing fine for time, but
3/4 was excellent.
So I'll just stop there really and ask if there are any questions. First of all.
Well, not a question, but thinking about the social networks in relation to language and linguistics, which is my background. I'm not really sure, are you trying to work out the membership of the social network? Because in language we would look at things like reciprocal naming, where you might ask a group to name their friendship groups and then check whether the other people who they name as friends reciprocate. Was it that kind of working out, or were you taking networks as already what they appeared to be?
To be honest, the social network analysis is really moving on to something that I'm only just starting. The cultural domain analysis is something that I've used in my doctoral research. The social network analysis I haven't really begun yet, but that sounds really interesting, and I'd be interested to hear more about that idea of reciprocal naming as well.
Well, the reason I mention it, because you're talking about the mechanisms of the social network, and again, applying it to language and linguistics, it's very much about membership and your place in the group, whether you're a core or say a peripheral member. Because who would you think would innovate in a social network? Would you think it would be the core members, or would you think it would be peripheral?
Presumably the periphery have more of an incentive to innovate in order to get into the core.
Yeah. Well, you're spot on actually, but it surprised me because the peripheral members, in a very politically correct term, Laval, the famous sociolinguist, refers to them as lanes. And you know, these are people on the edge of the circle, but he says that they act as bridges between other social networks, because they may be on the periphery of several networks, but they do tend to be the innovators, and the core members are the ones who want to keep everything, you know, the status quo, and you know, resist change.
I thought it was really interesting. I think it identifies the people who are in that social network, doesn't it? How does it represent the levels of influence? So all of these people influence this person in the middle. How do you know who influences them more than others? Is that in there anywhere?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. You know, and I think part of this comes down to the research question as well. That what I was interested in a way, was more how the people or the factors within children's sort of cultural domains interacted with each other, or how they saw one another, rather than specifically which one was more influential. Although I think that's something that is worth thinking about. I suppose Borgatti talks about this idea of salience, that if you were interviewing lots of people within a social network, you'd be able to kind of triangulate between their different perspectives as to who's the more influential. Or I think Borgatti talks about how often and also how quickly people have mentioned. So if people are talking about naming the friendship group, is there one person who's always up at the top as well? You know, they're the linchpin of this group.
I'm not sure this is a question either. Just a lot of aspects of what you talked about are really interesting. So in relation to influence, when I was listening to you talk about influence, I was getting the impression that your conception of influence is something that operates in one direction, rather than being kind of reciprocal. I mean, so it's influences, being imposed by these kind of invisible presences onto kind of children within a certain environment, but presumably these spheres of influence are kind of. So have you looked at that at all, or is it just something that's not?
Again, it's not something that was part of the research question, because the research project was looking at religious education in schools. But of course, what happens in school influences those young people outside of the school as well, and influences the community. And just as I wasn't able to explore what the community's real status was in the school, I also wasn't able to really understand what influence the school had on the wider community. You know, that was another thing that was absent, I suppose, and that's important to reflect on as well. Thanks.
And then just one other thing, which is probably more fundamental to your whole approach in relation to the whole concept of invisibility, let's say, and the distinction you seem to make between something that might be inherently invisible or something visible that is rendered invisible. I'm curious to know more about the kind of nature of that difference, because I would think that when I was listening to you, actually, I was reminded, because I do a lot of research into blindness, and I talked to blind people about their experience of wind, the wind as the experience of a windy day, and they're saying that people who can see don't really experience the wind as sort of intimately as blind people, because what we conceive of as the wind is the impact that the wind makes. So we picture a line of washing, being blown about, but so we're losing out. Some blind people have said on the physicality of the experience of wind, because we reduce it to its. There's some sort of preoccupation with visible manifestations of things, which maybe the natural element is invisibility. And if you think about it in relation to what people like Kirby have said about fury, how fury derives from the ancient Greek word, which has connotations of seeing and being seen, and there is, and I think if you, there's a danger that if you're approaching something that is invisible, but you're determined to kind of bring it to light and render it visible, that you change it in that process, and so that would be problematic from the researcher's point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this idea of the making visible, or the making invisible, Vitalia's work on these axe blades, it's about something that obviously does have a material existence, and have the picture up of what they look like. There's a sense of something that does have influence, that does have agency in some sense, at least in the kind of post-humanist sense of having some kind of agency within the meaning making of that society. Part of how it functions is its hiddenness. Part of how it functions is its absence from kind of the day-to-day. And I wasn't sure whether there were similarities with certain things in schools, particularly was something I thought about when I was thinking about the likes of field trips and parents' evenings, where things occasionally come to light, but in a very kind of occasional way, in a way that makes them, that gives them a certain kind of power by their normally being absent. And I think it's a really profound point about this idea of something that is more powerful because of its absence, or because of its invisibility. There's another anthropological example that I was going to use. I've forgotten the name of the author now, but she writes about the Gimi, who are another South Pacific culture who had this mythology around flutes. There's this mythological kind of association around the Guinea flute, which was something that only the men were allowed to have, and only the men were allowed to see, that the women weren't supposed to look at the men's flutes. There's obviously Phallic symbolism in that as well. And one of the things that the Australian missionaries did when they first came to the Guinea villages and towns to preach Christianity to them, one of the first things that they did was to make people look at these flutes, to kind of demystify them through the act of looking at them and seeing that nothing bad happens. There's no curse that attaches to these things. That they're just kind of mundane musical instruments.
It's an interesting example because a flute is something that is designed to make a sound, and fixating on its visual. I don't know if you've come across the work of David Howes and Constance Classen. They're sensory anthropologists who do a lot of work about artifacts, from different cultures that don't privilege vision the way we do, but we tend, through a process of cultural imperialism, bring their artifacts to our societies and display them in very visual ways, which inevitably involves losing a lot of the power of these kind of artifacts.
Yeah. Well, I just did that there, didn't I?
I wasn't going to say
I was going to say that, yeah. I didn't really think about it until I actually didn't know what those looked like until I was preparing this presentation, and I went, maybe I should use a visual illustration. It's all text. Maybe I should use a visual, and that's the first time I've ever actually searched for what they look like. Anyway, with apologies to This terrible agricultural landlord. Any other questions? Anything else?
Just an interest, or you may not find it interesting, but the trio of Grand Island has been mentioned. I remember reading about them some time ago, and they bite on their partner's eyelashes in the heat of passion.
We all do that.
That's stuck in my memory for some reason. So, an interesting group.